So, I'm back. Another video. This one is going to be a little story how I managed to run Half-Life 2 on a graphics card from 1998 that didn't even know what DirectX 6 was. Well, it did know, but performance was terrible. And because absolutely nobody cared, almost nobody ever found about it. I guess that's just my curse, to stay somewhere even lower than the underground itself. But we'll get back to that later. For now, behold, Half-Life 2 on 3DFX Voodoo 33500. That was a recording of me actually running this damn 2004 version of Source Engine on. Wait, you're probably wondering, how is this even possible to run Half-Life 2 on a 3DFX Voodoo that has terrible DirectX 6 performance? And another question, how did they even get this running on a processor without SSD instruction set? Well, I did all of this through 86 box, which means it wasn't a real PC but an emulator. Technically it's still real hardware, just emulated. Back then, around May 2025 or whenever I recorded that video, my main PC had a Penfilovic AMD FX 8300 overclocked as far as I could push it. And even that wasn't enough to emulate the machine properly. Everything was lagging. The emulator was running at around only 22-29% speed while you need 100 for it to feel normal. Just launching Half-Life 2 took somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. Now let's talk about how I actually pulled it off. Since the FX Voodoo 3 3500 has no performance in DirectX, I had to use custom Amiga Merlin drivers that added a bunch of extra features. So then I grabbed the configuration from someone who had done something similar except on a Riva TNT, which also supports DirectX 6 but properly and has 16 megabytes of VRAM. For comparison, my Voodoo only had 12 megabytes of video memory. And technically, it was a much weaker card than the Riva TNT when it came out to OpenGL and DirectX rendering. All of this preparation took me around a month. First I tried Windows 2000, then Windows XP, then something else refused to work. I'd spent an entire day trying to figure out one problem, only to find out that the solution was ridiculously simple, and I did every bit of it alone. At some point it stops looking like dedication and starts looking like either autism or just plain insanity. Unfortunately, none of my friends really shared my excitement once it finally worked. Might as well talk a little about the hardware itself. The processor was a basic early AMD K6 from 1987 running on socket 7. Nothing special about the motherboard either. I think I gave the machine around 700 megabytes of RAM, although realistically Half-Life 2 would have been perfectly fine with 128 megabytes, since that's basically the engine's limit from back then. You need to wait at least 20 minutes for this thing to finally start. And the funniest part is, once it does, you can't really do anything except walk around. Yeah, you can open the menu, just don't open the graphics settings, otherwise crash. The game also has to be launched with map launch parameters, so instead of loading the main menu it immediately loads a map. But here's the funny part. In practice, only one map actually works, and even there you can only walk around the beginning. Go any further, crash. Now let's talk about how I actually pulled this off. The funny thing is, for the longest time I thought the Amiga Merlin drivers were translating DirectX into Glide. Turns out that's not actually how they worked. Even though the 3DFX Voodoo is mostly remembered as the Glide graphics card, Voodoo 3 actually had native Direct 3D support. The problem was newer games expected hardware features these cards simply didn't have anymore. That's when Amiga Merlin came in. Instead of translating DirectX into Glide, the drivers modified and extended the original 3DFX code. They added compatibility tweaks, registry optimizations, and even software emulations for some DirectX features like hardware, transform, and lighting, letting the CPU do work that newer GPUs normally handle themselves. In other words, the drivers were basically trying to convince modern games that the hardware was more capable than it really was. I've also heard people talk about DirectX being converted into Glide, but that's actually a different story. That mostly came from old OpenGL wrappers like MiniGL and MesaFX, which really did translate OpenGL calls into Glide. So yes, Half-Life 2 really was talking to Direct 3D, not Glide, which brings up the next main question. If the drivers solve the compatibility problem, why does the game still crash? It all comes down to limits. If Half-Life 2 tried to use more than 256 kilobytes of video memory, the game just dies. The reason is simple. Amiga Merlin was never designed for games like Half-Life 2, and somewhere in the driver there's a hard-coded limit. I've already forgotten exactly where it is, since all of this happened about a year ago. Hopefully the idea makes sense. That's basically how it works, and honestly, this is where my obsession with Source 2004 really started. After Reddit absolutely tore me apart and that video completely flopped, I moved on and started making other videos for my old Russian channel D5XD. Then, during the summer of 2025, I suddenly remembered something. My very first childhood PC was an Athlon XP 1800 running on socket A, so I decided to build a completely error-accurate machine around that platform for another video. That damn video ended up costing me around 3000 rubles. I even had to buy video converters just so I could capture the screen properly. In the end, I actually did it. But the problem was that the video itself turned out to be complete garbage. I didn't even bother editing it. This was so long ago that instead of using my usual character obsolete guy, I was still using. Yeah, thankfully that's been left somewhere far in the past, and at some point I completely forgot about it. As far as I remember, that became the last video on the channel. Then everything happened the way it happened. The channel got terminated. I won't go into the details, but back in 2021 I used way too much copyrighted music, and over the years quite a few videos were taken down because of it. Nothing more to say. So, summer 2025. After all those failures, I moved on to making an ARG, but I never forgot about that old Athlon XP. At the same time, I was still actively working on Desert Parable, so one day I got curious. Could run Source SDK 2013 on an old Athlon XP. Turns out I couldn't. I spent almost an entire month trying to figure out why. I searched all over the internet, and the reason came down to one company, Intel, and the funny little thing called SSE 2. Back in the early 2000s, AMD and Intel were constantly trying to outdo each other. One year AMD would win, then Intel would strike back. Then Intel introduced SSE 2. The Pentium 4 wasn't exactly a great processor. It ran hot, wasn't practically impressive in single-threaded workloads, but there was one thing it had that Athlon XP didn't. That one damn instruction set. And that became Athlon XP Achilles heel. You couldn't just add SSE 2 later, it was a part of the processor itself. By around 2007, Athlon XP was basically dead when it came to gaming, because more and more engines started using SSE 2 just to launch. Search engine eventually went down the same path. Valve didn't just remove the old DirectX 6, 7 and 8 rendering paths. They also dropped support for processors like Athlon XP. by the time Source SDK 2013 came out, support for those really old CPUs had disappeared completely, and with it, at least to me, the feeling of the original Source engine disappeared too. The atmosphere changed. Everything was replaced with something newer, and somewhere along the way, the original feeling of Source 2004 was lost. The original Source SDK from 2004 was buried by Valve for good. There's no complete working version left. Yeah, you'll find bits and pieces on GitHub, but even Hammer doesn't launch. So I think it's fair to say that version has basically been erased from history. Almost nothing is left of it. But what exactly was Source 2004? In 2004, the long-awaited Half-Life 2 was finally released, powered by what was, at the time, the groundbreaking Source engine. The graphics were incredible. They genuinely were, but there was another side to it. The game could run on almost anything, even processors without SSD support like the AMD K6. Officially, Valve listed a DirectX 7 graphics card as the minimum requirement. Unofficially, the engine still supported DirectX 6, an API that had already existed since 1998. And as you already seen, I actually managed to find what is the absolute minimum hardware capable of launching Half-Life 2. A video card and a CPU that was never intended to run Half-Life 2, which was the Source Engine 2004. So, if you don't know, I'm currently making my own mod using Source SDK 2014. It's a fun game based on the Cinderpar Ultra Deluxe. When development first started back in January 2024, I chose my base simply because I thought, well, it's better than regular SDK 2014. Besides, I needed all the extra entities it came with. Fast forward to May 2026. By then, I'd already started writing code for my base myself. At first I just wanted to add PBR support and experiment with a few other things. Back then, I didn't even have the slightest thought that I'd eventually make my own fork. Then came the end of May. I'd already added things like Vue with a bunch of other small features, and suddenly an idea hit. Why not make my own official fork of MapBase? Not just another personal codebase, but a fork that actually adds interesting improvements. I called it Reach for the Source Engine. Yes, it was inspired by RE Engine. The idea was simple. This fork was my attempt to reach a version of Source that was never actually existed. Then June came around. I realized I needed to write just to let people know the project wasn't dead. And while writing it, another idea came to me. Why not add 2004 to the name? After all, the whole thing was inspired by Source 2004 anyway. And from there, everything just snowballed. I already brought back bunny hopping the way it worked in Source 2004 by removing Valve later movement fixes. And I'm planning to bring back even more. At this point, the fork has become something like an alternate history of Source, a version of the engine Valve never removed the old rendering path, never threw away all those older systems, and simply kept building on top of what Source was back in 2004. For now, the fork keeps growing, and so does the desert. So, why did I even decide to make this video? I think the answer is pretty obvious. The biggest problem is that I'm somewhere below the underground. On ModDB nobody leaves comments, and when someone finally does, it's usually just some random nonsense instead of actual feedback. YouTube isn't much different, just lines. And now Iron Horse, so bitrate Spoon doesn't count, he's my friend, and he watches everything I make anyway. I don't have a big platform like, for example, NoClick, where I could just make one post saying looking for programmers to help build my source fork. By the way, NoClick, if you somehow watching this, thank you. I've been watching your videos since you even started covering Half-Life mods. So, for almost 2 years of developing this game, nobody has really helped me. There was one person once, but in the end, just like always, they disappeared. And I spent the rest of 2025 completely alone. Things haven't really changed since then, and honestly, I don't think I can build an entire Source Engine fork by myself. I already have a lot of ideas. What I don't have is programmers willing to help bring them to life. And before some, why don't you just ask on Discord servers? I already did, back in summer of 2025. Nobody answered. I asked on Reddit too. The answer I got was simple. Pay us. Well, I'm writing this script on Atlan 643000 from 2004. I simply don't have the money or resources to pay developers. And little by little, I'm starting to lose the last bit of motivation I have left. This video is attempt to find someone who genuinely likes the idea of this fork. That's all I wanted to say. If you want to reach me, you'll find my Discord server on my personal website. Even then, I doubt anyone besides my friend will leave a comment under this video. But if by some miracle this video reaches the one person who understands why Source 2004 is worth preserving, then it was worth making. See you. Probably not for the last time. It's already 9:52 PM. I should probably get some sleep. And remember, reach for the Source Engine 2004, built to be explored.
Thank you.